From Alabama, Mr. Palmer is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Craddock, how does geology impact the process of fracking, the composition of the formations that you're fracking?
Obviously, that's one of the things we rely on operators to look at. But if there is a fault, and that fault is a known fault, then we make sure that we're not allowing drilling to occur in that fault first and foremost. We take that into account, as do companies. That's part of their risk assessment as well.
All right. In that regard, isn't it true that the geology of Texas, the history of it is that there's been more than 100 earthquakes large enough to be felt over the recent past? How many of those could, the ones in the 1800s, the early 1900s? I've got a whole list of Texas earthquakes that occurred before fracking. Why do you think that happened?
Yeah, you've done your research. Obviously, you know, we had a question earlier about Irving. When you look at the history of Irving, it actually is an earthquake capital of Texas. That really, we don't have really any oil and gas going on in it. So I think it's a fair suggestion to think there are other things besides just oil and gas causing earthquakes at this point.
How about Oklahoma? There's been a long history of earthquakes in Oklahoma. I know it may not be a fair question for you since you're not from Oklahoma, but isn't that true as well, that there have been a number over the last 100 years of earthquakes in Oklahoma that probably were not attributable to any human activity?
I believe, even though I'm not from Oklahoma, we obviously share a border, and we pay attention and work with their commission as well, and so that would be a fair statement. Yes, sir.
It's also true of Colorado, and it's a little more difficult because they've only, in terms of history, recently been tracking Colorado earthquakes. I think maybe the earliest was 1870, but they had a series of earthquakes that occurred in Colorado that caused damage in the early 1900s in Denver, and obviously there's more damages, there's more building and more settlement and more people moving in. You start to notice these things as there's more people. I'd also like to cite something from a report from the University of Texas Institute of Geophysics, the Jackson School of Geosciences. Talks about along the Gulf Coast, northeast Texas, the earthquakes with the magnitudes between M4 and M4.8. It says, fortunately, the vast majority of petroleum fields and injection wells do not cause earthquakes, and the majority of human-caused earthquakes are small and harmless. Would you agree with that?
That's what we've seen thus far, yes, sir.
Thank you. Also, in regard to methane emissions, since we're on the topic of the University of Texas, there was a research report done through the University of Texas that was done in close coordination with the Environmental Defense Fund. I think one of our witnesses works for them, and they've basically found that EPA's estimates for methane emissions are far lower than what anti-fracking groups frequently claim. As a matter of fact, I think as the newer technology has been employed, that they're capturing most of these emissions now. Could you validate that?
While we don't do air emissions, we do work with our sister agency, the TCEQ in Texas, and they are telling us and believe that air emissions for methane have dropped about 70% in Texas since 2001.
So could we possibly conclude from that as the technology has improved, the methane capture has improved along with it?
I believe that would be a fair conclusion, yes, sir.
Thank you. One last thing is, it was mentioned that that states ought to be able to regulate. Well, actually, it was Justice Brandeis was quoted, but I believe it was Justice Brandeis that referred to the states as laboratories of democracy. I agree with that statement, and I think that the states have, particularly since they have more knowledge of their geological issues than the federal government does in many respects, that these things should be dealt with at the state level. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. The gentleman from